The first time Don Big Daddy Garlitz stood at the starting line after the explosion, old school racers swore they had never seen a man look so calm, standing next to a machine that almost ended his life. And here's the insane part: nobody expected him to ever come back. Nobody. Because on March 8th, 1970, at Lyons Drag Strip, Don Garlitz wasn't just in a crash, he was blown apart by it. Literally, the clutch in his front-engine dragster exploded with the force of a grenade, slicing the car in half, cutting through the chassis like a razor, and severing half of his foot in a blink. Spectators screamed. Crew members froze. Old racers said it was the worst mechanical explosion they had ever seen on a drag strip. 1 second, he was the king of the quarter mile. The next, he was lying on the pavement, bleeding out, staring at the sky as medics rushed in. Everyone thought it was over. His career, his future, his life. But Garlitz wasn't thinking about dying. He wasn't even thinking about pain. He was thinking about one thing: there's got to be a safer way to build these damn cars. And that single thought, born in agony, surrounded by chaos, would change drag racing more than any rule book, any engine, or any NHRA decision ever made. They rushed him into surgery. Doctors told him he'd never drive again. He'd never walk the same. Forget racing, just living a normal life was going to be a challenge. But while his body was being rebuilt, something much bigger was happening inside his mind. Because Don Garlitz wasn't just a racer, he was a builder, a thinker. A man who believed machines could be smarter, safer, and faster than anything that existed. And lying in that hospital bed, staring at ceiling tiles for weeks, he began designing something the world had never seen before. Not a repair, not a revision, a revolution. The rear engine dragster. The insane idea that all the experts said would never work. The design the old guard mocked as impossible, unstable, uncontrollable at high speed. But Garlitz didn't care about their opinions. He cared about one memory: the sound of metal ripping his car apart and the pain that followed. That scream in his head became his fuel. And the all-caps truth every racer would learn soon enough was simple: Big Daddy wasn't done. He was just getting started. When Don Big Daddy Garlitz finally left the hospital, he didn't walk out like a broken man trying to recover. He walked out like a man on a mission, slow, limping, stubborn, but burning with a kind of determination that scared even the people closest to him. Everyone expected him to take time off, maybe retire quietly, maybe disappear the way so many racers did after catastrophic accidents. But Garlitz wasn't wired like that. He didn't believe in fear. He didn't believe in can't. The minute he got home, surrounded by the smell of machine oil, welding sparks, and half-finished engine parts, he told his crew something that made their stomachs drop. We're building a new car. And not just any car. A car nobody had ever built before. A dragster so different from the rules, the tradition, the entire culture of the sport, that some racers said it would get him killed twice as fast. The idea was simple. The execution was terrifying. Put the engine behind the driver. Flip the entire layout of what a top fuel dragster was supposed to be. And 20 years of tradition in one stroke. The old-timers called it madness. The magazines called it unnecessary. A few people weren't polite. They said it outright. Garlitz has lost his mind. But what nobody understood was this: Garlitz wasn't chasing fame anymore. He wasn't trying to impress Detroit. He wasn't trying to win championships. He was trying to beat death. He remembered the explosion, the fire, the metal slicing into him, the months in the hospital bed. Every nightmare, every flashback, every jolt awake in the middle of the night became fuel. And in that Florida workshop, half garage, half laboratory, he started sketching. At first on napkins, then on cardboard, then on the back of old-time slips. A rear-engine dragster that wouldn't explode beneath the driver. A car where the blast radius was behind you, not under your legs. A machine that could survive the violence of nitro without turning the driver into shrapnel. His crew watched him work like a man possessed. One of them said later, he didn't blink for days. The man was building that thing with anger. Welders buzzed, steel bent, Fiberglass dust filled the air. And for the first time since the accident, Garlitz smiled not because he felt good, but because the blueprint in his mind was finally becoming real metal. The car looked strange, wrong, too long, too tall, too unfamiliar. It didn't look like a dragster. It looked like a prototype for something America hadn't invented yet. Racers who visited the shop would stand in the doorway, arms crossed, shaking their heads like they were staring at a crime scene. Tom McEwen says it'll fishtail at 250. Garlitz is gonna flip that thing the second it hooks. It's suicide, beautiful suicide. But Garlitz didn't listen. He never listened. He just kept building, grinding, measuring, rebuilding. And when the thing finally sat on its own, wheels high, lean, alien-looking, he stepped back, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and said something nobody expected from a man missing half a foot. "Let's see if I still know how to drive." The comeback wasn't official yet. The engine hadn't fired. The car hadn't moved. But the feeling in that shop was unmistakable. Drag racing was about to change. Not slowly, not politely, violently. And Big Daddy was the man holding the match. When the rear-engine dragster was finally ready to fire, the crew didn't celebrate. Nobody opened a beer. Nobody cheered. They all just stood there, staring at the long, strange-looking machine like it was some wild animal Garlitz had dragged in from the woods. It didn't look right. It didn't sound right. It didn't feel right. But Garlitz didn't build it to feel familiar. He built it to save his life. The first test wasn't at a national event. It wasn't in front of fans. It wasn't even at a real track. Garlitz chose a small, quiet place in Florida, a forgotten strip of asphalt behind an orange grove, where he had tested cars since the 1,950 seconds. The kind of place where the air always smelled like citrus, motor oil, and Atlantic humidity. A place with ghosts, old racers, old runs, old victories, old failures. He rolled the car off the trailer, and the sound of the tires touching the ground made everyone tense. It was too tall, too long, too experimental. One crew member whispered, "If this thing snaps in half, we're all done." Another said, "It just doesn't look American, doesn't look like a dragster." But Garlitz ignored every word. He was limping around the car, checking every weld, every coupling, every line. The Florida sun beat down on his back, and his damaged foot, still swollen, wrapped, aching, dragged slightly with each step. But the pain didn't slow him. Pain never slowed him. He climbed into the cockpit. No ceremony, no countdown. Just a man lowering himself into a machine that didn't exist 6 months earlier. A machine born out of blood and stubbornness. A machine every expert said would kill him. He buckled himself in, took a breath, and then something changed. Everyone watching felt it. A shift in the air. The same shift that happens before lightning hits the ground. When the engine fired, the entire orange grove shook. Birds flew out of the trees. Dust rolled across the asphalt. The rear-mounted Hemi didn't roar like the front-engine cars they all knew. It screamed. The difference was immediate. You could feel it. With the engine behind the cockpit, the weight balance was wrong. Or maybe it was perfect. Nobody knew yet. The vibrations moved differently. The chassis flexed differently. The air around the car seemed to fold in on itself. One crew guy backed away and muttered, "Dear God, this thing's alive." Garlitz didn't hesitate. He tapped the throttle once, just a blip, and the car jumped like a bull being shocked with electricity. The strip was barely a strip. No rubber laid down. Cracked pavement. Trees too close to the edges. A place where you'd test a bracket car, not rewrite history. But Garlitz didn't care. He inched forward, staged himself mentally, and then, without warning, he launched. The rear-engine dragster didn't fishtail, didn't spin, didn't drift. It shot forward perfectly straight, like an arrow fired from God's own bow. The crew stood there, stunned into silence, as the sound ripped through the trees and disappeared into the humid Florida air. No wiggle, no drift, no instability. All the things the experts warned about evaporated. The car reached the end of the strip and coasted to a stop. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. They just stared at the empty lane, waiting for the sound of disaster. But then, faintly, they heard the Hemi rev again as Garlitz turned the car around. When he drove back toward them, idling quietly, the crew didn't rush over. They didn't shout. They waited until he shut it off, lifted his visor, and looked at them with the calmest expression they had ever seen. "How was it?" one of them finally asked. And Garlitz smiled a small, tired, but confident smile, and said the sentence that would shake the entire drag racing world to its knees. "Boys, this is the future." That was it. That moment. That sentence. That test. It was the day drag racing changed forever. A quiet test run in an orange grove did more for safety, speed, and innovation than a decade of NHRA meetings. But nobody outside that little patch of Florida asphalt knew what was coming. Not the fans, not the sponsors, not the racers, and especially not the men who mocked the design and said a rear-engine dragster would never run straight. They were all about to be proven wrong, violently wrong. Because Big Daddy's comeback wasn't going to be slow. It wasn't going to be polite. His comeback was going to shake the grandstands, burn into memories, and leave every old-school driver asking the same question. How did we not see this coming? When Big Daddy finally brought the rear-engine dragster to a real event, the atmosphere wasn't hopeful, excited, or supportive. It was hostile. Drag racing in the early 70s wasn't just a sport. It was a culture, a tribe, a brotherhood built on tradition. And traditions don't like being told they're about to die. So when Garlitz rolled through the gates at Pomona, towing a dragster that looked nothing like the long, sleek, dangerous darts everyone was used to, the entire pit area froze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Tools hung still in the air. Even the loudspeakers seemed quieter. Old-school racers squinted. Crew chiefs frowned. Fans leaned over fences, whispering. One guy near the staging lanes muttered exactly what half the men there were thinking. What the hell did he build? Competing crews walked right up to it, circling it like it was a UFO that crash-landed in California. They didn't even try to hide their skepticism. One laughed. He finally snapped. Lost his mind. Another shook his head. Ain't no way that thing goes straight. A third jabbed a thumb at Garlitz. Man can't lift a toolbox anymore, but he's going 250 with that thing? Crazy. But the loudest opinion came from a veteran crew chief who'd been racing longer than Garlitz had been alive. He spat on the pavement and said, "Rear-engine dragsters don't work. They never did. They never will." That was the moment everyone thought the experiment was about to be exposed. Drag racers in that era had seen rear-engine attempts before. They failed, crashed, killed drivers. People believed deep down that the engine had to be in front, that the long wheelbase and weight distribution were sacred, that the sport didn't need reinventing, but they'd never seen this version. They'd never seen something built by a man with half a foot missing, running on pure fearlessness, pain, and anger. Garlitz didn't argue with any of them. He never did. He simply sat on his little folding chair beside the car, tightening a spark plug with one hand while rubbing his injured foot with the other, like he had all the time in the world. Then the announcer's voice echoed across the track, "Big Daddy Don Garlitz to the lanes." The crowd perked up. Even the people who disliked him, who resented him, couldn't resist seeing what was about to happen. Garlitz's crew rolled the strange machine forward, and as they pushed it toward the burnout box, people in the stands stood up, not clapping, not cheering, just watching, curious, suspicious, ready to witness a train wreck, or something they couldn't quite define yet. His opponent that day rolled up in a traditional front-engine dragster, a proven machine, the kind that had won hundreds of races, the kind everyone trusted. Side by side, the difference looked absurd. Garlitz's car was unfamiliar, uncomfortable. Even the silhouette broke decades of expectations. A track worker leaned to the starter and whispered, "You think he's gonna crash?" The starter shrugged. "Hope not, but hell, I'm not betting my paycheck." Then came the burnout. Garlitz eased the car forward, dipped the throttle, and the rear tires began to spin. But not like a normal burnout. This one was cleaner, straighter, controlled in a way nobody expected. And when he snapped the throttle again, the sound changed. It wasn't the usual violent front-engine thunder that echoed down the track. It was cleaner, sharper, almost like the car was breathing differently. Then he staged. Deep breath, eyes forward, one good foot on the pedal. The tree dropped, and the world changed. The car didn't wiggle, didn't skate, didn't drift. It launched perfectly straight, as if the asphalt had suddenly turned into rails. Crew chiefs watching from the fence went pale. Fans gasped. The veteran who mocked him earlier muttered, "No, no way." Half track, the car was still straight. Three-quarter track, it was still planted. And at the finish line, it posted a number nobody expected. A clean, stunning, almost effortless 6-second pass. The crowd exploded, not with cheering at first, but with shock. A wave of disbelief rolled through the grandstands. People looked at each other like they'd just seen a ghost walk through a wall. One man in the stands yelled, "He did it! That crazy son of a he did it!" Crew members from rival teams stood with their hands on their heads. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others grinned reluctantly. One whispered, "That damn thing's gonna change everything." And they were right, because the rear-engine dragster wasn't a gimmick. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a mistake. It was the future rolling right in front of them, whether they liked it or not. When Garlits pulled back into the pits, people didn't mock him anymore. They didn't laugh. They didn't sneer. They approached slowly, quietly, respectfully, like men walking toward a lion they'd underestimated. One old racer stepped forward, stuck out his hand, and said the words that would echo across drag racing for decades. "Congratulations, Don. You just ended the front-engine era." And he was right. The rear-engine revolution had officially started, and Big Daddy had lit the fuse. When Garlits rolled the car back into the pits after that first clean pass, people thought they'd seen the miracle. They thought the shockwave had already hit. But that run? That was nothing compared to what was coming. Because the next pass he made just a couple hours later did something even the bravest, cockiest, most stubborn old drag racers didn't think was possible. It didn't just prove the rear-engine design worked. It proved it was better. Let me paint the scene exactly how it happened. Afternoon sun, heat shimmering above the track. The kind of day where every bolt on a race car feels like it's sweating. Garlits sat under a cheap pop-up shade tent, his injured foot up on a toolbox, massaging the ache while his crew checked plugs, changed jets, and topped off the nitro. Across the pit lane, front-engine drivers watched with arms crossed, frustration boiling just beneath the surface. Because they knew deep down that if his next pass was clean, their era was over. A young driver walked by, trying to act casual. He failed miserably. "Hey, Don. Congrats on the run earlier." Garlits looked up. "Thanks, kid. You, think you can do it again?" Garlits didn't even blink. "Oh, it'll go faster." The kid swallowed hard and walked away. Word spread. And within minutes, the grandstands were filling again, even though it wasn't eliminations. People didn't want to miss whatever came next. The announcer's voice crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy is coming back to the line." A roar rippled through the crowd. But the craziest part? Even the racers who hated the idea of rear-engine dragsters walked toward the fence. They didn't want to support him. They wanted to understand him. They wanted to see what they were up against. The staging lanes cleared, almost like people were getting out of the way of a fire truck. His opponent, that round another respected front-engine veteran, pulled up beside him, but couldn't stop staring at the strange machine. He finally leaned over and said, "Don, if that thing blows up, you gonna haunt us from the afterlife?" Garlits laughed. "If it blows up, I'll be too far ahead to bother haunting anyone." Then came the burnout. The rear tires lit instantly clean, controlled, perfectly centered. The car didn't dance around. It didn't fishtail. It didn't snap sideways. It behaved like a machine that knew its purpose. The crowd felt it. You could hear it in the way their cheering faded into a stunned hush. When he staged, People held their breath. The tree fell. Garlits launched. But this time, it was violent. The rear engine design planted the tires like an anchor had been dropped from the chassis. The nose lifted, not dangerously, but confidently, like the car knew exactly where it wanted to go. 60 feet in, it was already pulling farther ahead than anyone expected. Half-track? Garlits later said the car felt like it wasn't even working hard. Three-quarter track? The rear engine advantage showed itself in the cleanest, most stable top-end pull anyone had seen. And then came the moment that changed drag racing forever. The scoreboard lit up. 5.63 seconds. Over 250 miles per hour. For a heartbeat, the entire track went silent. Absolute silence. Then, boom. A wall of sound. Screaming, cheering, gasps. Even people who didn't like Garlits couldn't deny what they just saw. Men jumped out of their seats. Crew chiefs slammed their hats on the ground. A kid in the stands yelled, "That's not a dragster, that's a spaceship." One old-timer shook his head, mumbling, "I just saw the end of drag racing as I know it." And he wasn't wrong. Because that run right there, that perfect, stable, straight, blisteringly fast run, broke an unspoken truth of the sport. For decades, everyone knew the engine belonged in front. Everyone knew the sport didn't need change. Everyone knew rear-engine cars were unsafe. And yet, there it was, a clean 5-second pass that looked effortless. When Garlits rolled back into the pits, dozens of people followed. Not fans, racers, competitors, icons, legends. They didn't congratulate him. They didn't shake his hand. They didn't smile. They stared at the car the same way soldiers stare at a new weapon on the battlefield. One of them finally broke the silence. "Don, you just killed our cars." Garlits didn't argue. He didn't celebrate. He simply looked at the engine, wiped some dust off the injector hat, and said quietly, "No, boys, I didn't kill them. They were already dead. You just didn't know it yet." That was the moment the sport finally understood. Rear-engine dragsters weren't the future. They were the present. And every front-engine car on the property had just become obsolete in one single pass. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, the pits didn't feel like a racetrack anymore. They felt like a funeral for the front-engine dragster, for an era, for the machines every old-school racer had spent decades perfecting. Word had spread across the entire facility. Garlits just ran a 5.63 inches, that rear-engine thing. At first, people didn't believe it. A few crew chiefs marched up to the scoreboard to stare at the numbers like they expected them to change. Others whispered that the timers must have glitched. Some said the track film crew misread the footage, and a handful, mostly the proudest, most stubborn veterans, refused to walk over at all. They sat with their backs turned, elbows on their knees, staring at the ground, like men who'd just been told their jobs didn't exist anymore. Drag racing had always been a sport driven by ego, big personalities, bigger claims. Every man thought he had the secret recipe. Every team thought their engine builder was the genius. But that night, something happened that was almost unthinkable. They all fell quiet. And whenever a front-engine car fired up in the distance, people didn't look excited anymore, they winced. Every bark of those headers reminded them of the risk they'd always tried to push out of their minds. One of the old legends, a guy who'd been running slingshots since the early 1950 seconds, stood beside his car, looking at the massive, supercharged V8 sitting right in front of the cockpit. He didn't say a word, just stared at it. A younger driver approached him and asked gently, "You okay?" The old man nodded. "Yeah, I'm just realizing I've been sitting between two sticks of dynamite for 20 years. He tried to laugh, but the sound didn't come out. That's when the ripple effect began. Drivers who used to roll into the lanes with swagger now hesitated. They leaned under their bodies, tightening belts twice, then a third time. Some kept glancing at the blower like it was a snake ready to strike. Others flat out refused to run until morning. They wanted daylight, safety crews, time to think. Garlits didn't gloat. That wasn't his style. His crew was tired. He was exhausted. His foot hurt. He wanted to pack up. But the racers wouldn't leave him alone. They kept coming, one by one, quietly, ashamed almost, asking questions they never thought they'd ask. Don, how stable was it? Did it lift? Did it drift? How bad is the visibility? Does it torque steer? Does it feel safe? That last one stopped Garlits cold, because he knew the truth. It felt safer than any dragster he'd ever sat in. No vibration through the frame, no torque twist ripping his shoulders, no shaking from the engine inches away from his knees, no heat cooking his legs, no oil blowing back in his face, no death trap between the rails. He answered them honestly. It's the best car I've driven. It's the future, whether you boys like it or not. Some nodded immediately. Others stared at the ground. One man muttered, "Hell, I don't want to change, but I also don't want to lose my head." Later that night, a quiet meeting formed behind the staging lanes. No officials, no announcers, just racers. The toughest men in the sport, suddenly human, vulnerable. For the first time in decades, they talked about fear, about funerals, about friends they'd lost to blower explosions, broken crankshafts, clutch grenades. They spoke names that made the younger drivers go silent, and every man there knew if they stayed with front-engine cars, those tragedies would continue. A Mopar driver finally stood up. I hate to say it, but Don proved it. We gotta build new cars. No one argued, no one shouted, no one called him soft. For the first time in drag racing history, the room agreed. Across the track, Garlits sat alone on a folding chair outside his trailer, sipping a Coke, the same way he'd unwound after 1,000 race days. He wasn't celebrating, he wasn't smiling, he was simply tired. But then, he heard something soft footsteps. He looked up. The same old veteran who'd spent his whole life building slingshots was standing there. The man raised a hand. "Don, I just came to tell you something." Garlits braced himself. Maybe anger, maybe accusation. The man reached out and shook his hand. Hard, firm, respectful. "You just saved a lot of lives today." Then he walked away. And that was the moment, right there, that the sport truly changed. Not when the scoreboard lit up, not when the crowd roared, not when magazines picked up the story. It changed when the old guard finally admitted the truth. The future wasn't coming someday. It had arrived that night. And every drag racer alive, whether they loved Garlits or hated him, knew they had just witnessed the end of an era and the birth of a new one. By the next morning, news of Garlits' pass had spread far beyond the track. Before sunrise, payphones were ringing in machine shops from California to Texas. Crew chiefs were waking up their drivers. Drivers were waking up fabricators. Fabricators were waking up welders. And every conversation sounded the same. "Did you hear what Garlits ran last night?" There are moments in motorsports that hit like a hammer. Moments when the entire sport realizes instantly that nothing will ever be the same. This was one of those moments. And the shock wasn't just about the time slip. It wasn't even about the safety. It was about something deeper. Something every mechanic, fabricator, and old-school racer felt in the pit of their stomach. Garlits' car wasn't a gimmick. It worked. And if it worked for him, it could work for everyone. Suddenly, the front-engine dragster, once the symbol of power, danger, and glory, looked like a relic. Outdated, primitive, almost embarrassing. The morning air around the track was filled with a strange mix of excitement and fear. Teams stood around their cars quietly, staring at the exposed engines like they were staring at a ticking bomb. And even the strongest, toughest racers, the ones who'd sworn they'd never change, found themselves asking a dirty, uncomfortable question. "Why am I still doing it this way?" One driver paced back and forth, hands on his hips, mumbling to himself. "I got 3 little kids at home. What the hell am I doing sitting behind a grenade?" Another man, one of the fiercest competitors in the NHRA, walked straight to Garlits without a word. He didn't shake his hand. He didn't congratulate him. He just stared him dead in the eye. "Don, I need to know. Did you ever feel like it was gonna blow?" Garlits answered honestly, "No, and that single word spread across the pits faster than nitro fumes. No. No vibration, no warning signs, no panic, no fear. Just speed, stability, control, safety. Drag racers were emotional men, loud, rowdy, competitive, stubborn, but under that layer of bravado, they were thinkers, calculators, risk analysts. Every time they climbed into a dragster, they did the math. Horsepower versus danger, speed versus life expectancy. But now, for the first time ever, the math had changed. They didn't have to accept the danger. They didn't have to sit inches behind a 1,500 horsepower supercharged V8. They didn't have to pretend they were invincible. When the NHRA officials rolled in around noon, they expected chaos, arguments, protests, drivers refusing to accept the legitimacy of the run. But instead, they found something far more unsettling: unity. Racers who hated each other, teams who never shared tools, mechanics who wouldn't even nod at each other in the staging lanes, all standing together, staring at the future. Nobody cared about politics. Nobody cared about rivalries. Nobody cared about the past. The only thing they cared about was survival. A tech inspector approached one of the oldest drivers in the sport, a man who'd buried more friends than he wanted to count. "You boys planning to go out today?" The old man looked at his dragster, at the raw power, at the exposed engine, at the scars on his hands from years of molten shrapnel, and shook his head. "Not until I start drawing something new." Teams began pulling their front-engine cars onto trailers, not for the day, not for the weekend, but forever. Some did it reluctantly, some did it proudly, others did it with tears in their eyes, because those cars had carried them through decades of glory and danger. But deep down, they knew it was over. An NHRA official, one of the toughest men to ever walk the track, spoke under his breath. "Boys, we just watched the front-engine dragster die last night." In one pit, a young racer, barely 20, turned to his father. "Dad, do I build rear engine next year?" His father nodded slowly. "You build rear engine from now on, and you never look back." Every drag strip across the country felt the tremor. Every magazine was writing headlines before the ink even dried. Every safety inspector was updating his rule book. And every old-timer, no matter how stubborn, knew the truth. This sport wasn't a gamble anymore. The roulette wheel had stopped, and Garlits had forced the world to pick the safe number. The revolution had begun. And nobody, not even the fiercest critics, could stop what was coming next. While racers were busy hauling their front-engine dinosaurs back onto trailers, something else was happening hundreds of miles away. Something quieter, colder, and far more political. In Detroit, the people who built the engines, wrote the rules, and secretly controlled the future of American horsepower finally started paying attention. GM, Ford, Chrysler, even AMC. Every major automaker had engineers who followed drag racing like religion. They went to events undercover. They subscribed to drag news. They talked to racers at bars under fake names. But that night, after Garlits' historic run, none of them were undercover anymore. Phones rang. Lights came on in offices that hadn't seen midnight electricity in years. Men with thick glasses and wrinkled ties rushed into conference rooms carrying clipboards, blueprints, and coffee that tasted like burnt rubber. And the question every single company asked, almost in unison, was this: how long before this rear-engine thing kills the old market? Because make no mistake, Detroit didn't care about safety. They cared about sales. The front-engine dragster was a symbol, a marketing tool, a postcard of danger that sold muscle cars to teenagers and big blocks to dads who still believed they were young. But now, the symbol of American horsepower had changed overnight, and the executives knew it. One Ford engineer slammed a magazine onto the table. "If Garlits keeps running like that, every kid in this country will think rear engine is the new cool. We're behind already." A Chrysler engineer fired back. "Behind? We invented the damn Hemi. That's in his car. What we need is the layout, not the motor." And GM? They stayed quiet. GM always stayed quiet. But silence in Detroit is never peaceful. it means panic. Across the table, a gray-haired executive finally spoke. "Gentlemen, drag racing just had its seatbelt moment." Everyone stopped talking, because they all knew what he meant. Seatbelts were ignored. Then they were mocked, then they were optional, then they were mandatory. And once they became mandatory, the entire auto industry changed with them. Rear-engine dragsters were about to follow the same path. Optional, mocked, feared, then unstoppable. But while Detroit's suits panicked, the engineers, the real brains, were thrilled. Some of them had wanted this for years, ever since the first time a scatter shield failed and turned a driver's legs into shrapnel. Ever since the first clutch explosion put a hole through a driver's ankle. They'd been waiting for a chance to modernize drag racing, and Garlits had handed it to them on a silver platter. An engineer at Chrysler, one of the quiet geniuses behind the 426 Hemi, leaned back in his chair and said, "I gotta hand it to him. He didn't just build a safer car. He built a faster one. That's the part that's gonna change everything." Meanwhile, at NHRA headquarters in California, the phones were ringing off the walls, fans calling, racers calling, promoters calling, even journalists calling with the same question: is NHRA gonna ban it? Because that's what happens every time something revolutionary shows up in motorsports. Ground effects in F1? Banned. Six-wheeled cars? Banned. Any idea that makes the old guard feel threatened? Banned. But the NHRA wasn't dealing with an unfair advantage. They were dealing with survival. One NHRA official said quietly, "We can't ban safer, not this time." So instead of banning it, they did something shocking. They started rewriting the rulebook in Garlits' favor. New weight rules, new chassis guidelines, new safety protocols, new fire equipment regulations. By sunrise, NHRA had already accepted that the sport had changed. In one night, one pass, one explosion of speed. And just when Detroit thought they understood what happened, something else hit them even harder. Garlits wasn't done. Word leaked from Florida that he was already planning revisions, tweaks, experiments, a new wing, a new steering box, a new geometry. He wasn't defending the future, he was building it. And Detroit realized something they hadn't felt in years. They weren't leading American horsepower anymore. A man in a small Florida workshop was. By the time summer rolled around, the rumors had grown louder than the engines themselves. Every drag strip in America, from Pomona to Indianapolis to tiny outlaw tracks hidden behind cornfields, was buzzing with the same sentence: "Garlits is bringing the new one today." Nobody even called it a dragster anymore. They called it the new one, because they knew deep in their gut that whatever rolled out of that black trailer wasn't just another update. It was another step into a world nobody had seen before. When the trailer door finally opened, the pits went dead quiet. This wasn't the prototype people saw in the first run. This wasn't the rough draft built by a man recovering from an explosion. This was refined, sleek, sharper than a razor. The welds looked cleaner. The chassis sat lower. The motor was mounted with an angle that made engine builders drool. And in the middle of it all sat the heart of the beast. Another 426 Hemi. Only this time, it was tuned to a level that made other racers nervous just looking at it. Someone whispered, "My God, he's really gonna do it." Another murmured, "If this thing hooks, we're in trouble." But the reaction that mattered most came from the old school guys, the ones with oil permanently embedded in their hands and ears, ringing from a lifetime of open headers. They weren't jealous. They weren't angry. They weren't even competitive. They were stunned. Because these men built the sport. They risked their lives for it. They carried it through its wild years, its dangerous years, its heroic years. And now they were staring at something that made everything they built look ancient, primitive, outclassed. For the first time in drag racing history, progress had a face, and that face belonged to Don Garlits. When he rolled to the line, the crowd didn't cheer, they didn't scream, they held their breath. Every person in those bleachers knew what happened last time a Garlits dragster made history. he lost half a foot. They knew what could happen if the design wasn't perfect. They knew how unpredictable rear engine layouts still were. You could feel the fear, the admiration, and the respect mixing into one electric moment. The starter looked at Garlitz, raised his hand, and stepped back. The lights fell, and the world changed a second time. The launch wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It wasn't wild or unstable. It was clean. Too clean. The tires bit the track with a grip nobody believed possible. The dragster shot forward like it had been yanked by a steel cable. No fishtail, no drift, no smoke, no correction. It went straight, so straight, it looked fake, like someone slid it on rails toward the finish line. People didn't cheer, they didn't move, they didn't blink. Even the cameraman forgot to zoom because he was staring over the lens, hypnotized. At half-track, the Hemi ramped up to a scream that cut through the stands. At 3/4, the rear wing was slicing the air so cleanly, it looked like the dragster was floating. And when Garlitz crossed the line, the silence shattered. The crowd erupted. Old men threw their hats. Teenagers jumped the fences. Photographers sprinted down the strip, and the announcer, usually calm, usually steady, lost every bit of professionalism he had. Ladies and gentlemen, the future of drag racing just arrived. The numbers came over the speaker a moment later, numbers that made every racer lean forward and every engineer go pale. 5.63 seconds, 250 plus mph. A pass so clean it looked illegal, a run so straight it looked impossible, a speed so high it made front-engine dragsters feel like relics. And Don Garlitz? He didn't pump his fists. He didn't celebrate. He didn't climb the roll cage like drivers do today. He just unbuckled, stepped out, and waved to the crowd like a man acknowledging a truth he already knew months ago. Because that pass wasn't a victory. It was a message. A message to Detroit. Catch up. A message to NHRA. Rewrite the rulebook. A message to every driver still sitting behind a front-mounted ticking bomb. Move the engine or get left behind. And most importantly, a message to the sport he nearly died for. I told you there was a better way. You could feel it before anyone said a word. The sun was going down, the smell of burnt rubber still hung thick in the air, and the pits were buzzing with a kind of electricity nobody had ever felt before. Mechanics stopped wrenching. Crew chiefs stopped yelling. Racers' men who had spent their entire lives tuning front-engine dragsters with their bare hands were standing still, staring at the return road like churchgoers waiting for a preacher to speak. Then they saw him. Don Garlitz, helmet under one arm, firesuit half unzipped, hair soaked with sweat, walking back toward the pits with the calm of a man who had finally put a ghost to rest. A few younger racers clapped first, then some crew guys, then a scattered handful of fans, and before long, the entire pit area was on its feet. Not cheering like they did for a record run, but applauding like they were witnessing something sacred. Garlitz didn't smile. He just nodded, shook a few hands, and made his way toward his trailer. But the old guard, the real old guard, the legends who built the sport from nothing, they were waiting. These were the men who lived through the dangerous years of front-engine brutes, the explosions, the fires, the clutch blasts, the funerals. They were the ones who had looked Garlitz in the eyes months earlier and said, "Rear engine won't work, Don. It ain't stable. It ain't safe. It ain't drag racing." And now they stood there silent, humbled, respectful. One of them finally stepped forward, an old racer with a chest like a refrigerator and hands blackened from 6 decades of wrenching. He didn't say much. Men from that generation never did. He just placed a hand on Garlitz's shoulder and muttered, "You did it, Don. You proved us all wrong." Another old-timer chimed in, "Hell, you saved us." Because that's what this was really about. It wasn't about innovation. It wasn't about breaking records or showing off engineering brilliance. It was about saving lives. Almost every legendary driver from the front-engine era had scars from clutch grenades, oil fires, blower explosions, or worse. Some didn't survive long enough to have a retirement. But after that night, after that impossibly straight, impossibly fast rear-engine run, everything changed. That same evening, race officials held a private meeting behind closed doors. Nothing formal, nothing written down, just a handful of NHRA decision-makers sitting in a cramped trailer, sweaty and stunned, and one sentence hung in the air like truth carved in stone. We can't allow front-engine dragsters anymore. Not after this. They didn't ban them right away, but the writing was on the wall. Every team owner knew it. Every chassis builder knew it. Every engineer with half a brain knew it. They had seen the future. They had watched it blaze down a quarter mile at 250 miles per hour without drifting an inch. They had watched a design that was supposed to be too experimental, make the best drivers in America look outdated. That night, the conversion began. Slowly at first, quietly, secretly, but it began. And by the time the next season rolled around, the pits were filling with long, elegant, rear-engine dragsters, wearing fresh paint and untested designs. Every one of them built on the blueprint of the machine Garlits had risked everything to perfect. Older racers, who swore they'd never change, suddenly started calling chassis builders. Crew chiefs, who once mocked the design, began measuring wheelbases and fuel delivery angles. And fans, millions of them, watched the sport transform right in front of their eyes. From chaos to precision, from danger to engineering, from bravery, the center of this shift stood a quiet man from Florida, 1 foot missing, both hands calloused from decades of wrenching, who had refused to let tragedy be the end of his story. A man who rebuilt himself, rebuilt his machine, and rebuilt the sport. A man who taught drag racing the most important lesson it would ever learn. Sometimes the future doesn't arrive politely. Sometimes it shows up in a fireball and comes back stronger. Drag racing was never the same after Garlits. One man changed the machines, the rules, and the future of the sport. If you enjoyed this story, hit like, subscribe, and stick around. The next legend is even wilder.